Good morning, folks. Welcome to this week's edition of Webinar Wednesday. We're joined today by Maurice and Aaron from Hall & Wilcox, who are here to talk to us about council tenancies and the COVID-19 pandemic and navigating through the maze that has sprung up as a result of that. Obviously, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Maurice and Aaron, so I'll be quiet. Just before I hand over, if you have got any questions or comments that you'd like to make during the presentation, please pop them into the chat window and I'll relay them to our presenters for you. We'll discuss them as we're going, so don't feel like you have to save what you want to say or ask till the end of the presentation. Please pop them in there as it occurs to you, and we'll talk through it as we move through. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Maurice and Aaron. It's all yours.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you for the opportunity to present to my local government sector colleagues on this very topical matter about tenancies and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. My colleague Aaron Harmon and myself, we're from Hall & Wilcox, that some of you may know. I can see some familiar names from those who jumped on a little earlier. We're a national firm with a strong Sydney presence who are very, very active in the local government space in all manner of areas concerning local government. Myself, I'm more of a transactional lawyer working in commercial matters, and in terms of how that affects local government, that's property matters, construction contracts, planning agreements and so forth. Aaron works a little bit with me in that space and is also helping my colleague Stan Candilius, that some of you may know, in a range of planning appeal matters and also some highly sensitive governance matters where we do some governance work for councils who are having the sometimes unfortunate experience of having to deal with ICAC and other agencies like that. So today's seminar, as I said a moment ago, is about council tenancies and COVID-19. There's a PowerPoint presentation that I'll speak to along the way. As Aaron Lucas said, if you've got questions, pop them in. Happy to divert to those along the way. Perhaps we'll solve a problem or two along the way. So the way that the summary of the slides, or the areas that we'll be speaking to today, will be firstly a little introduction about how this is relevant to the local government sector, in particular councils. We'll talk about the eligibility criteria that apply, that tenants must meet for them to get the protection of these new laws. We'll talk about what are called prohibited actions or prescribed actions, basically the things a landlord can't do, particularly pertinent to councils because more often than not you're a landlord than a tenant. We'll explore some of the benefits that tenants enjoy from all of this. We'll spend a moment talking about what this means for landlords and how council should proceed. We'll touch upon the dispute resolution process that is part of this, where parties can't strike an agreement, and then we'll close it out with our take outs on the best way to go forward. And I'll also along the way speak to some examples that are alive and kicking that are on our desks at the moment, where we're helping both landlords and tenants in this space. So firstly, councils. How does all this affect councils? Well, it obviously does. Councils own property in many different ways and control properties in many different ways. You have a very wide range of capacities. You're both what I call a regular landowner of normal, in New South Wales, Torrens land, but you're also a roads authority, which allows you to give limited licences and occupancies under the Roads Act. For many parks and reserves, you could be a reserve trust manager, or it could be just a reserve that has a community classification. These new, what I'll just call the COVID tenancy laws, really don't discriminate about the capacity in which a council owns or controls a land parcel which it grants some kind of occupancy right or tenancy over. It just talks about tenancies generally. It describes them generally. It describes landlords generally, and it describes tenants by an eligibility test who can make use of the rights and benefits. So that's an important thing to begin to bear in mind at the beginning, because in the local government sector, we're very used to having particular rules applying in local government space, and this is an example where some of those rules actually don't apply. We're in the same bucket as every other commercial landlord about how to deal with our tenants who are experiencing difficulties and are seeking to exploit the benefits that this has. Equally, it also means that where we're a tenant, we might also have some opportunities. But as I said a moment ago, I know that we are rarely tenants, but there are examples where we are. So where did all these laws begin? Well, they actually started back in the beginning of March, when we would have heard the early announcements by the Prime Minister, in particular his announcements around what was called the mandatory code of conduct, or just the code of conduct. That is the cornerstone of what these COVID tenancy laws are. If you haven't got a copy, you should get a hold of a copy, because it is the guidance for the negotiations. The code essentially sets out a playbook. It's really a policy document that has leasing principles, and the principles are the matters that parties need to have regard to negotiate through difficulties. Through the narrow legal lens, a part of the code which is very important is when it talks about it being enacted in each state by its own state's laws. So it's actually, if someone is telling you that they've got to comply with the code because the code's mandatory, the strict legal answer, certainly in New South Wales and in most other states, is, well, no, it's not. The key provision in New South Wales is what's known as the Retail and Other Commercial Leases COVID-19 regulation that was enacted on the 24th of April 2020. So in any situation where either a council wearing a landlord or tenant hat needs to dive into a COVID tenancy problem and whether to agree a rent reduction and how to go about it, that's the reg where you start. Thankfully, it's not a very long reg, so that makes it quite easy to work through. But equally, it means that there are very few rules in the reg to guide the myriad of situations where you will have tenants seeking some kind of concession, deferral, waiver, or whatever. The date is important, 24th of April, because that reg has a 6-month lifespan. So in the absence of any legislative change, the regulation will no longer apply from the end of October, and it's back to situation normal, if I could call it that. It's also important to note the date, because it's not the date that the code was announced by the Prime Minister in early March. And it's also for any of you, any of you folks that have an interest in local government and speak to colleagues in other states, is that different states have enacted this at different points in time. So everyone's time frame is a little bit different. It's fair to say that 6 months is the rule of thumb, but none of them end at a uniform date. So that's the context and the background in which all of this is happening. So there are two key threshold tests. Sorry, I'll put it differently. Any discussion around these COVID laws for a tenancy, you've got to look at the lease itself, and you've got to look at the eligibility criteria that apply to the particular tenants. And you'll see on the slide that's there is under the heading of eligibility, which touches on those two things. So the regulation talks about commercial and retail leases. For any of you that want to look at the reg, by all means, you'll see it's broken into two parts. There's one part that applies to tenancies that are under the umbrella of the Retail Leases Act, and then there's a schedule that applies to basically every other tenancy. And essentially, as you'll see from the slide, we are talking about leases entered into before that particular date, but excluded from the eligible leases, if I can call it that, agricultural leases and license arrangements. There are no other specific exemptions listed. My view about excluding licenses is that they are always well, they're excluded in my view because they're not a fully fledged tenancy, and the majority of tenants will be under leases for periods of years and not really a license arrangement. It does pose an interesting question about where, say, especially where a council might have licenses and hires of cafes in parks rather than leases, but it's probably a degree of detail we can go into some other time. The critical part's the date. So if we sign, I had an example with a commercial tenant who owned a string of sunglass shops around the country, and they were faced with a situation where they had chosen not to exercise an option. So therefore, they had no lease that commenced before the 24th of April, and they were unhappy with the commercial terms that were being thrust upon them for the new deal. And the only way that they could manipulate or manoeuvre it so that they could have the benefit of these new retail tenancy laws was actually to sign up to the documents having the terms they didn't like, and therefore be eligible, and therefore rely on the protections we'll talk about later to try and get the benefits and get some rent reduction that they were otherwise trying to get. So the date was important. The other key eligibility test is around what in the New South Wales legislation is called impacted lessees. It's given different labels in other states, but basically the two limbs of it are pretty much the same in most states, is that the tenant must be eligible for JobKeeper. And I suspect that some of you may, especially those who are more of a finance bent, have probably had cause to look at JobKeeper and trying to work out whether they can apply or friends of theirs can apply. And the other part is around the turnover limit. And the turnover limit that is in the regulation is clearly geared around commercial operations. It's very high at $50 million. I would suspect that the vast majority of tenants that a council has that would be seeking this kind of relief would be nowhere near that kind of turnover. I suspect that they're really more of the cafe licensees in parks or of that ilk. Even if they're not, I think it's pretty fair to assume that any tenant that a council has is probably going to tick the box on being an impacted lessee, and that means, to put it crudely, they have a ticket to the dance in terms of seeking the benefits and engaging in the negotiations. One other quirk of the New South Wales legislation that doesn't appear, that's different to the other states, is that there's no express provision in the New South Wales regulation about confidential information. Some of the other states require a tenant to provide what would otherwise be, essentially their business data to help a landlord determine whether or not they're impacted. And of course, it's also relevant for the negotiation. This doesn't appear in New South Wales, so you can have a situation where a tenant is very loath to provide data about their business to their landlord, and I can completely understand that. But I think that if you're going to, if you're a tenant and you're going to a landlord, whether it's a council or whether it's any other commercial landlord, and you're seeking some kind of concession on the basis that my business is going poorly, I think you need to produce some information that shows that that is indeed the case. I recognise it's awkward. I recognise that it's probably something that would be difficult to do. It probably clashes with some tax planning that some of these tenants may have done, but it's certainly something that I think that should be done and should be proactive about. If nothing more, because the clear message from the Prime Minister when he announced the code was that he required parties to engage in genuine dialogue. And genuine dialogue to me seems having to share information to show that you are indeed suffering because of the COVID pandemic. There are some tenants where that's obviously easier to describe than others. For example, if a council tenant is some sort of hospitality site, well, we know from the social distancing rules that they essentially had to close down for quite some weeks, although there's some loosening up now. So that was actually pretty simple to prove. But there may be, but there are other examples where For example, a council might own some land where it has a commercial tenancy. Perhaps it has some, an accountant's practice and so forth that operates from there. Well, those people weren't as badly, or those kind of businesses weren't as badly affected. And I guess I could use Hall and Wilcox as a case in point there, in that, yes, the majority of our Sydney office, and in fact nationally, are working remotely. And that was in reaction to the social distancing rules. But we don't know whether we're in the office or not in the office is not something that's particularly front and centre about the performance of our business in a financial sense. So it's a big point of distinction that I think a landlord has to keep in mind when we're engaging in this discussion. So once we've ticked the boxes on eligibility about we've got what I'll call a qualifying lease or an impacted lessee, well, what does that mean? So the regulation lays out a number of constraints and benefits. We'll firstly deal with the constraints, and you'll see in the slide there this term prescribed actions. In a nutshell, the regulation lists things that a landlord cannot do for the period from 24th of April for 6 months. The period can be a little bit different. I'll come back to that in a minute. It's a detailed matter. But essentially, a landlord cannot take what I'll call the traditional lease enforcement actions for monetary default, and we'll touch upon that a little bit more a little bit later. So if we pause for a moment and think where we have a tenant who is in default, what are the things that we as a landlord would be doing? Well, the first thing that comes to mind would be drawing on securities that we have, be they bank guarantee, be they cash deposits. Another one that's equally important would be exercising some termination right, be that physical exclusion or seeking an order for possession. The other thing we might be doing is we might choose to commence proceedings to recover a debt that's due, which falls under that bullet point action for damages. Essentially, all of those things are off limits for a lease that qualifies and for a person who's an impacted lessee. So it's fairly easy to see that it is very, very awkward for landlords to exert the kind of leverage that they previously had on tenants who have the benefit of the regulation. Just touching on the period for a moment, the way the regulation is drafted, it certainly is 6 months, but a little bit later on we'll talk about a dispute resolution process. So the prescribed period also comes to an end where that dispute resolution process has ended. Now, I guess technically or conceptually, that could be before the 24th of October, but I think it is highly, highly unlikely. And I'll touch a bit more upon that a little bit later. For present purposes, just keep 6 months in your mind. So the benefits for impacted lessees, I guess, we've touched upon and they're pretty obvious, is that the landlord cannot take what I'll call the traditional enforcement actions, but there are some other, lessee benefits, landlord disadvantages, if I could call it that, listed in the reg. And the key ones you'll see in the presentation that's before you, and they're about a rent freeze. It's also no rent reviews, and it's also, as you see, the exemption from paying fixed contributions. The best way as a tenancy manager that you should probably look upon this is that you have a standstill. Whatever the status was on the 24th of April, for 6 months, that's the position that's going to be the case going forward. And assuming that your tenant would continue to pay rent because they're not seeking, some kind of renegotiation, all of the, what I'll call the variable amounts in your financial aspects of your tenancy are going to be frozen as at the 24th of April. The other key benefit that appears in the reg, which is what the Code of Conduct was all about, was entitling tenants to ask landlords for rent relief. It starts with a tenant simply approaching a landlord and asking for, in the New South Wales context, a rent renegotiation. And the rent renegotiation is essentially cutting the deal that works for the landlord and tenant to get by the pandemic difficulties. You will have seen in the press, and you've probably heard some of your colleagues, and you're sure that you've been talking to estate agents and other tenants, and people bandy around terms like waivers and deferrals and abatements, and they'll quote the code that says, oh, it's got to be a 50% abatement and it's got to be a 24-month deferral payback. Look, all of those things are are half true. They are laid out in the national code as though they are black letter law, but they're principles and a policy statement. And when you look closely at the regulation, you will see that it says that one must have regard to the leasing principles in the rent negotiation. Stripping all the technicality away, what that means is look at the suggestions in the code, use them as guidance for the deal that you will cut to do the rent renegotiation that works for the landlord and the tenant. They will be different for every tenant, probably. They'll also depend upon the circumstances of the landlord. What we're seeing is that they're always a mix. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to our examples a little bit later. So what does this mean for landlords? Well, I think, as we've touched upon already, there are things you can't do, and we don't need to cover those any further. But the other thing that you now have a positive obligation to do is you must engage in good faith negotiations with a tenant who asks for a rent renegotiation. Sadly, this is where it does get a little bit sticky, because there is little guidance in the regulation about how that negotiation is to be conducted. It doesn't prescribe timeframes. Councils are very used to, especially wearing their planning hat, about rigid timeframes and stop the clock mechanisms because of legal rights that pop up if applications haven't been determined within certain timeframes. Well, none of that applies in this COVID space. That is both, good because it gives you plenty of flexibility and latitude. It can also be bad because it means that there's plenty of scope for being somewhat opportunistic. And Aaron and I have seen that on both sides of the landlord and tenant table, which we'll come to a little bit later. In my view, the key of it is engaging genuinely, and the other key is to have available the relevant data. Whether you're the landlord or the tenant, you need to know what your situation is, what has happened to you financially, how has your business been impacted on both sides of the equation, so that you can properly assess what is an appropriate balance. I've been privy to lots of negotiations where I've heard landlords say, yes, but I have lots of fixed costs that need to be met. And that is a legitimate cost, and that is a legitimate claim. But I kind of view that as something that a landlord can use in a negotiation to say, well, instead of paying me nothing, pay me something so that at least I can keep my taxes being paid. Easily said, much harder to do. I recognise that. The other thing to bear in mind, harking back to the prescribed actions in this area, and it's relevant to how this affects lessors, is that the prescribed actions that I talked about only apply essentially to financial default. So if you have circumstances in your particular tenancies where there are non-monetary defaults, such as failure to keep in repair, failure to insure, assigning or subletting without approval, all of those non-financial matters are not subject to this handbrake that's imposed by the COVID laws. I'm not saying that enforcing those things is easy. Enforcing tenancies at the best of times is a fraught and difficult task. And of all the tenancy defaults that are the simplest, in inverted commas, to enforce, it's monetary default. But nevertheless, it's important for landlords and tenant and in particular councils to realise that the non-monetary matters are not off the table. And so I am involved in one situation at the moment for a council client that is indeed a matter where there are non-monetary defaults that are causing a lot of grief, and the strategy being adopted by that council is to aggressively administer that tenancy. Basically, where they're going to be giving this fellow living hell about the works that have not been done. And the purpose of it is to create a body of evidence that can put the council in the best place position when and if it makes a decision to pull the default trigger. And it can go and do all of that without being constrained by these prohibited actions that are tied to rent. So as we said a little moment ago, these things apply to whether you're a landlord or a tenant. So councils have available to them the same kind of benefits where they're a tenant. Now, admittedly, I think it's probably going to be very difficult for a council because it wears its public sector hat to go to a private sector landlord and claim that its business has gone south, because, you know, it's not as though the council sells goods and services that have gone south because of the pandemic, and I accept that that will be difficult, but it doesn't mean that you don't have, that you cannot ask and that you cannot approach a landlord because of that. And what I'm seeing is that how you conduct those negotiations and the offers that you make can be a tool to renegotiate some tenancies and perhaps get some rent relief along the way. So it's in this area that I'll probably talk to a couple of examples that I've got at the moment, which Aaron and I are involved in. One involves a corporate client who works in the manufacturing, warehousing and building supply space. So they have a variety of tenancies across the nation, everything from relatively small outlets to large warehousing facilities. And they are, and because they're an ASX listed company, they're not eligible. Their turnover doesn't satisfy, because the way that the turnover eligibility rules apply is that it's done on a group basis. But this has not prevented this client or these folks from engaging with their landlords to seek a bit of COVID relief. Because the truth of the matter is that some of their group businesses have indeed suffered, especially those that are more retail sector facing. And the way that they have gone about it is that they've been able to have available information of what's happened to their turnover. And what they've also done is gathered information about rents and tenancies in the same towns and cities and vicinities of where their buildings are and where their outlets are. And so what they have also done is that they've also sought to de-risk some of their sites where they've had upcoming options with market rent reviews to approach their landlords and ask for term extensions in exchange for some permanent and some temporary rent relief. And they've been quite successful in achieving that. Many of their landlords are private companies. So when you have a group company of an ASX company wanting to, rather than exercise an option, extend automatically now, it's been quite attractive to them. And they've also had some traction with some institutional landlords. So those kind of measures are examples of being ready and having a proposal that gives something to the landlord, not take something away. And that's an intro into the second example that I've mentioned there in hospitality, where there is one client who we act for, who we are helping, who is both a landlord and a tenant of a restaurant operation. And the way that, and they are having a very difficult time negotiating rent relief with their landlord, because they are being very, very difficult and being very aggressive, and are not willing to provide any reduction at all because they're just being tough, extremely tough. Whereas on the flip side, where these folks are a landlord, it's a restaurant in CBD Sydney. They, because I guess of their restaurateur background, they recognise that the outlet had been closed for several weeks. Equally, when the relaxations have come online, and many of these restaurants have started some phased opening, they've managed to not yet conclude, but go some way down the path of a structured rent, I guess, reinstatement, if I can put it that way. They've accepted, essentially a waiver for the period in which the social distancing laws said can't pay, that you can't operate. In their particular situation, it was a grossed up rent. So the topic of outgoings, they've just had to take on the chin. Whereas in my first example, there's been no attempt by that particular client to not pay their outgoings. They've only been talking on the rent account. Going back to the hospitality example, the agreement they're getting close to striking is, as the relaxations go from 0% to 50% to 100% over time, is they're looking for the rent to be reinstated to its former level as things get back to the 100%. And that's probably a good example of being genuine and a genuine attempt to share both the pain and the benefits of these things. I mentioned a little bit earlier about how there is a dispute resolution process that applies. It's hardwired into the regulation, and essentially it piggybacks onto the mandatory dispute resolution that applies under the retail tenancies legislation. Some councils may be familiar with that if it's cross swords with some of its retail tenants. For those tenancies that are not subject under the retail tenancies umbrella, the regulation essentially mandates the same kind of mediation, and you've got to take it to the Small Business Commissioner, who is the forum that conducts the mediation under the retail tenancy legislation. So yes, there is a circuit breaker, if I can use that word, where you cannot strike an agreement for this rent relief with the tenant, and that's a good thing. But sadly, there are no timeframes and no what I call helpful guidance in the regulation or the code about how to go and do that. So you are really left to your own devices around how you set yourself up for that dispute resolution. And the reason that you need to do that is because being brought under that residential tenancy framework is that you can't otherwise commence proceedings for any kind of default until the mediation has failed. And you'll recall that I touched on a little bit earlier how it's a 6-month time frame, but it might be shorter. Well, this is where that comes into play, in that the prohibited actions for a landlord, that constraints released or removed when the Small Business Commissioner certifies that the mediation has failed. To me, the more practical issue is that likely to happen before the end of October? And I think the answer to that's probably no, given that you would need to have at least 2 or 3 attempts to engage in some negotiations and a paper trail around that. You then have to refer it off to the Small Business Commissioner, who is going to be busy. And even in the best of times, mediations do take upwards of sometimes 6 to 8 weeks to unfold. And given that today's the 10th of June, and you add time to negotiate, you add time that would ordinarily take before the Small Business Commissioner, and then perhaps add a contingency around them being a little bit busier because of COVID matters, I think the end of October will be here before you know it. Personally, I think that you will probably see some legislative extension to the October date. I have nothing concrete that tells me, or no inside information about that, but I just feel that it is, if economic difficulty continues and the data that's coming out about the economy continues to be poor, that the state government may extend that date. or if it doesn't extend that date, there will certainly be other measures in play to try and continue this sharing of the pain approach that happens. Certainly, I haven't been involved in any dispute resolution before the Small Business Commissioner yet. In the various negotiations and matters where we're helping landlords and tenants at the moment, including council clients, we're still in the negotiation mode. And truth be told, I'm not expecting any of the ones that I'm involved in at the moment to end up in mediation. I think a deal will eventually be done because of the commercial pressures that apply to each of them. There are, of course, lots of other COVID laws that impact upon tenancy arrangements, and some of those may not be so obvious to, or may not be so pertinent to councils, but there's still things to bear in mind. They're the land tax. One of them is in the land tax space. Across all the nation, across all of these states, there are land tax relief. I know councils don't pay land tax, so therefore where it's a landlord, it's not so relevant, but clearly where a council is a tenant and there is land tax relief to be had by its landlord, that's something that it can use to seek some kind of moderation for the fee, for the money that's going out the door. Another change in FIRB laws that, again, may not be front and centre for particular councils or to council tenancies, but certainly very alive in the commercial space, was a change in the FIRB approval requirements that apply to tenancies. Now, I know that FIRB is something that is not common in the local government space, but if you have any tenants that are the subsidiaries of foreign persons, foreign companies, essentially the changes that were made towards the end of, I think it was about the 3rd of April, basically mean that no new tenancy or any substantive extension of a tenancy requires a FIRB approval. So that then means that some negotiations that you may have had underway with a particular tenant have really been hit with another hurdle to overcome. As I say, it's not something that I think would be common across the local government sector, and I'd encourage any of you that are confronted with that, or you have a tenant who is negotiating with you who might be caught by this, to get in touch with us separately. There are some structuring ways that you can bypass that. It's only a temporary bypass. The educated thinking for the experts in that field is that there will be a tinkering of those FIRB requirements to loosen things up, because they've essentially taken a bar that was very, very high and made it zero, which in my view is an overreach. So what are some of the do's and don'ts that you need to do? And I know that Aaron skips a slide there and he'll go back to it. So the key takeouts is negotiate. And you'll see from the slide there are, just 3 things to do and 3 things not to do. It is engage in a genuine way. It's the best way to go about it. Gather the necessary data. Ask the other party to gather the data. If you're a landlord and your tenant is looking for relief and they won't give you that data, repeat the request for it, because it does position you better in any mediation. That it might help to fast track, a failure of the mediation if we've got to apply a bit of strategy. You also need to be looking at what your rent reviews are during this 6-month period, because that's relevant to how you administer these tenancies over the few months going forward, to make sure that you comply with these new requirements. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I've been talking for nearly 45 minutes, so you're probably all sick of death of the sound of me. You'll see in that Aaron's just brought up, myself, my partner Kitty and Aaron. If you have any questions, happy to field them now. If you want to raise some questions offline, either through Aaron Lucas at LGP or directly, by all means. There are no right and wrong answers in anything to do with tenancy renegotiations. It's essentially whatever deal you can do that's right for you. The only comment or the last parting comment I'll make is that experience tells me that in these types of rent negotiations, I think council is participating in it from a point of disadvantage, because you'll be looked upon as government, and in this particular climate, everyone's looking to government for help. And sadly, I know from my years of working with local government, of all the levels of government that are least geared in terms of financial capacity to help its local government, yet you will have, I suspect that you will have tenants looking to you as though that you can absorb it, and that's a tension, which I'm sure that any of you that are in finance departments of councils who are on this webinar would be well and truly alive to. I'd imagine that you've had a very interesting budgetary session moving up to 30th of June, trying to work out how to balance all these things. And that's enough from me.
Maurice, thank you. Folks, does anyone have any questions or any comments that they'd like to raise while we're all here? Let's have a little look-see. Aaron, I might actually just unmute you, and you can speak to that question or comment you've just made. Bear with me a second while I find you in the list. Third Aaron for the call. So, Aaron,
you can never have too many Aarons, mate. You can never have too many Aarons. It's all good.
Oh, we've got 3 of them now.
the more the merrier.
We've got A1, A2, A3.
So Bathurst Council's got a tenant who's in the hospitality game who did shut during the COVID period. They've actually have now reopened to limited trading, but for all intents and purposes, yes, were adversely affected. They are in receipt of the JobKeeper allowance. And so part of our council's internal assessment of their financial hardship position, we actually asked them to provide a copy of their financials for April-May 2020 as well as April-May 2019. When you add back the impact or the benefit of the JobKeeper allowance, they're actually better off in 2020. And so our question is, are they actually in financial hardship?
That's a really, look, it is an interesting question. It's quite something that I've seen pop up from time to time for many businesses, that because of the way that the JobKeeper works is that some of their staff are better off. So, for example, if I go back to, and I'll come back to you, to answer your question about is there any guidance on assessing, the answer is no. There's nothing in the reg. You can look at the code, it's got some general words around it. They're really leaving it people to try and negotiate an outcome. We touched in the hospitality client that I mentioned a little bit earlier, we actually touched upon this in a discussion about how we would be speaking to our tenant around what the rent, about how it would ramp back up to normal, because our client being a restaurateur and looking at the seating numbers and looking at the patronage that they have and the fact that they've been doing 2, 3 and 4 sittings, is that even though they're only at, say, 50% capacity because of the social distancing rules, we know from watching what's going on that they're virtually back to full, back to trade that would sustain full rent. And so what that client's trying to do in that is to use that back against them, simply from our own business knowledge of having run restaurants and knowing how many people are there, and saying that, we work in your industry, and you know that if you've got 25 people there, the spend's going to be $100, so therefore you're getting whatever the maths is a session. So you can't say that it's zero, because you've now only got, say, 20 patrons and you've only got 2 staff, whereas before you would have had 10 staff. And so it's simply being inventive about using that kind of analysis to pull the rug out. It's probably not the way to describe it, but just to cast doubt on their position, because many tenants are crying poor, and sometimes it's not so poor. And sadly, the hardship that there's no guidance about what that is. Yes, the turnover criteria gives you some insight of that, but it's not everything. I recall another discussion with some folks who are in the childcare sector, and they had sold out of a childcare centre and did a sale and lease back. And they did their number, their tenant had not been paying any rent at all. And when they did their numbers with what was going on in more recent times, especially with the free childcare and funded by the government, they were actually the business was doing better than at the time they sold the business to them. It was just another example like yours where you're saying, yeah, but they just can't be right. And so I think all you can really do is hold your ground, lay your paperwork, and then shift it off to the Small Business Commissioner if you really want to make life difficult for them. And it's probably more a case of trying to do that strategy to force an outcome without having to go there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
Iron fist velvet glove type scenario if you want to talk a bit of US presidential history.
Marianne, you had a question?
Yes, I've got a number of leases and licenses that are expiring on the 30th of 6th, and I have a couple of other ones in August and September. Of those, a couple have actually applied for financial assistance. Now, by the code, we noticed in there that payments for rental deferments are over a balance of no less than 24 months. So what happens if your lease is expired? Because it says further on there that tenants should be given the opportunity to extend their lease and licenses to actually pay these deferrals. What's the go there?
I think the 30 June date is just a real headache because the regulation was what's in the reg and what's in the code about giving them the opportunity to extend is really about trying to extend tenancies to give ongoing tenants an opportunity to pay back the deferral. But you don't have to agree to the extension. So, for example, in the business example I gave a little bit earlier, is they're looking to extend their tenancies that probably don't expire for another 12 or 18 months. So where they're doing their deferrals and paybacks, we're now looking at periods that are 3, 4, 5 years down the track. So there's ample time. And this is just not working in your example, which is unfortunate. Seems to me that what you can really do is you have to factor in, you've got to factor in and what your reduction would be, what the deferral period would be, and match that against how much longer you would need to do perhaps what I'll call a temporary extension to at least get that deferral back. Yep. So look, it's not pretty, but it's just the timing doesn't work for you. Because, a commercial landlord might say, no, bugger that, I don't want to extend it at all, force them to sign a new lease that's entered into after the 24th of April and corner them. I can't see a council adopting such an opportunistic approach because wearing the government hat, you'll cop too much flack around that.
Yeah, the publicity would be not very good. Another one I've got is the evidence of JobKeeper. I've had a printed off sheet from one of my applicants off a website for that. Is that sufficient as evidence that they've got the JobKeeper allowance?
Oh, look, I think it probably is, as long as it's right, as long as it's accurate and it's not, and it is genuine. There's perilously little in the reg about what kind of evidence you need. It just simply says you've got to qualify. So, if they completed the forms and they look as though they're formed, maybe you could ask for confirmation that they've indeed been filed, perhaps ask for a copy of whatever the ATO or whichever body it is that approve, I should know that, but I don't, who you lodge them with, to verify that they've indeed been received. Because often it's very easy to say, oh yeah, I went and did it and just give you the form, but forgive me for being a bit of a pain in the butt. I want to know that you gave it to the person that had that you had to give it to. And surely, and sharing an acknowledgement from them of receipt is not particularly confidential. At least then you know it's in the pipeline over there.
Yep. Okay. So I've got one more question, and you sort of touched on it on a hospitality one where they had been closed and now they're opening up. So we've actually, for this cafe, they were closed and now they've opened up in June. So we've actually given them 100% rent waiver for while they were closed because it's part and parcel of a museum that we own. But now they're opening up. Is it unreasonable to ask them for their month by month incoming so that we can adjust the rent each month up until October to get back to that 100%? Is it unreasonable to ask them to do that?
Look, I don't think it's unreasonable in this crazy climate that we're in about all of this. The whole these COVID laws in New South Wales and the national code announced by the Prime Minister was all about socialising pain and socialising profit because we're in a pandemic. And if that means that you've got to share a bit of information to get what's called genuine balance, to have the genuine negotiation, to strike a balance that shares it, then I don't think that that's unreasonable. Perhaps one thing that one can do to help with that is that people might be sensitive about that data. You could proffer it being held confidential. You could proffer signing up some type of confidentiality undertaking to demonstrate that we're not going to be opportunistic in how we use it. And you can do that with some confidence because GIPA laws do give you a little bit of scope for things that are, commercially in confidence. It's, it's a little tighter than it used to be under the old FOI laws, but I think there's scope there to give them something to encourage them to share with some information to get the numbers right.
Okay, good. We're just deciding which way to go, whether just do it now and just give them the benefit right through to October, or to stagger it and so it's not completely against council that we're giving everything. They're staggering it as well.
Yeah, look, there's no right answer. You've just got to try and strike it right. My personal view on all these things, it doesn't matter whether you're council or private sector, is it's got to be a fair share. And if that means you're going to pay a little bit, well then that's what the equitable underpinning of all this is. But that's just a personal view about it.
All right.
But we are seeing examples of some tenants being opportunistic and some landlords being opportunistic, and that's just awkward.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Are there any other questions or anything else you'd like to raise while we're still running here? I think that might be it, actually. Maurice and Aaron, thank you both very much for your time today. Also to Therese from Hall and Wilcox, who's lurking there. I'm really appreciative of all of the partners at Hall and Wilcox and everyone's efforts to help us with webinars. It's been excellent. There's still more to come. We're not done. But yeah, there's the help from Hall and Wilcox has been excellent and really good for LG professionals and our members. Okay, folks. If there's nothing else,
Aaron, you're welcome to share the seminar, the PowerPoint with anyone who's tuned in, or
excellent,
just
thank
let
you.
my Aaron H know and he can send it to them. Happy for people to have it.
Fantastic, thank you very much. All right, folks, thank you everyone for attending. Maurice and Aaron, thank you both again for your time.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
We'll be back next week with an extended webinar Wednesday for integrated planners. I should have a finalised agenda from the network executive in the next couple of days. I know that we've got Karen Purser coming from OLG to talk about impacts to the IP&R practitioner space as a result of COVID-19 and a number of other planning issues that will be discussed as well. Alrighty, folks. Thank you all. Enjoy your week. We'll see you again soon.